At the time in my life I wrote the Requiem in the mid-1980s, I was still working almost exclusively in response to commissions that I received. As a professional composer, you pretty much wait for the phone to ring. Somebody asks you to write something, and if it seems like a good idea, then you sit down and write it. I'd been working that way for about 15 years, I suppose, and was finding it stressful in some sense, or at any rate, a little bit worrying in that people tend to ask you for more of what you've written already, and it's quite difficult to break out and do something different. And so the Requiem was actually unusual for me at that time because it wasn't a commission. It was just something I felt I wanted to write, but it's important to me to have a performance opportunity. I don't write music to just put away in a drawer. And so I called up a very dear friend of mine called Mel Olson, who was my first host and patron in America. He commissioned me to write the Gloria in the 1970s. By the mid-1980s, he had moved to California and was Minister of Music at a large Presbyterian church in Sacramento with a good choir, a good but not exceptional choir. And he was there when I rang and I said to him, look, if I write a Requiem, would you be interested in giving the first performance? Have me come over and conduct it. And if I could use your choir in your church, would that be something you'd like to do? And he said, yes, do it. And so I had a performance opportunity, a very nice offer. And in a way, it was good that he was in the situation he was, because this was not an absolutely virtuosic crack choir from some top university. This was good local volunteers who were well trained, but of a technical ability which was sort of in the middle, really, of where choral music is. So it was apparent that I shouldn't write anything that was too difficult to sing. I knew I didn't want to write something that was too difficult to listen to, but I had a goal in mind when I wrote this. I could picture the choir, I could picture the church and the situation because I'd been there before. And so I sat down and wrote, but illness intervened, which was slightly worrying when I thought of poor Mozart writing his Requiem and dying before he could finish it. Luckily, I got better. I didn't manage to complete it, however, and the first performance in the church in Sacramento was only 4 of the 7 movements. But I was encouraged by the response, and I thought, well, I really must complete this. And so I wrote the remaining 3, and contacted another good friend of mine, Alan Pote, who was Minister of Music at a Methodist church in Dallas. And I said, Alan, this will shortly be a finished work, I hope, and would you like it if I come and direct your choir with a performance that, on this occasion, would have full orchestra, because this is something they like to use in that particular church. The original 4 movements had been in the version that is just with chamber ensemble, organ and 6 instruments. And so people sometimes wonder whether the larger version of the accompaniment or the smaller one came first. And I think I can truthfully say that both were in my mind from the first, but the original version of the 4 movements that I did in the performance in Sacramento were just for the smaller group. And people sometimes say, do you prefer one version to the other? The answer is really, I don't have a preference, because it depends entirely on the sort of choir you've got. If you have a small group, it's probably better to use the chamber instrumentation with organ and 6 instruments. You gain a sort of intimacy from that. On the other hand, if you've got a chorus of 200 or more, as I often have had in the performances I've directed in Carnegie Hall in New York, you certainly want the symphony orchestra version. So from the first, there were 2 parallel versions of the piece, and I really should record my great gratitude and the encouragement I received from Mel Olson and from Alan Pote in making the work happen. I'm one of those composers that finds it quite difficult to finish anything if I haven't got a deadline, and in both cases I had deadlines that were quite strict, and I well remember that I was still writing the Lux Aeterna the night before the first performance in Sacramento, that it very much came at the last minute, some of it. But that was really what got me going. Publication followed, and I had no idea what would become of the piece. I think most of us who write music would say we only ever expect what we write to get performed once, and anything beyond that is a bonus and unexpected. And you know, one can only just write a piece, and what the world makes of it is something we can't control. And the piece had not been in print for very long when my astounded American publisher, Don Hinshaw, told me that the piece had received over 500 performances within the first 6 months of its publication within the United States of America, and that was just performances where people had rented instrumental parts, and so there was some way of counting. There were probably other performances that had taken place just with organ or piano accompaniment, and I couldn't believe it. I think he couldn't either. But what it must have shown is that in some sense, that piece I wrote filled some sort of a gap in that in church, you can't really perform the Verdi Requiem. You can perform the Fauré, you can perform the Duruflé Requiem, smaller scale works. And there hasn't really been very much in the way of other small-scale requiems since then. So one of the reasons it got so many performances was probably that there was a slot for it to fall into. And the concert version began to get performed also. It's not a very hard work to sing or to play. It needs careful and sensitive preparation, but technically I don't think it's too difficult to do. And of course it's not a hugely long work. It comes in at just under 40 minutes. And I think it's probably true to say that it's continued to be performed all over the world, including, much to my surprise, in countries where there's really not a strong Christian tradition, for example in Japan. And I think there must be some way in which the experiences of which the text speaks, of bereavement and loss, of desolation turning into consolation, I think those must touch some sort of a nerve. And I've had numerous letters from people since I wrote the piece who have often told me very movingly of their own bereavement experiences and said that in some sense the piece has helped them through. And I think in that case one just has to say, well, the texts are wonderful, they're timeless, and they speak of these great experiences. And in setting them to music, one always tries to be the humble servant of the text. And so it continues. I don't think I shall write another Requiem. I'm not going to break the mold here. I think I've said what I really want to say. Some people might say it's wishful thinking that everything ends in light and blessing. We don't know that that's going to happen. But I think the faith and the hope that it might is one of the things that sustains us on our life's journey. And I don't think it hurts to make a statement about that.